Well, welcome to our next How conversation. We'd like to welcome today Admiral James Stavridis, retired Navy. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're listening from, sir. How are you today?
Doing well down in Florida, and all goes well here at the moment. Watching a couple of hurricanes. It is that season, but things are going well. Thank you, General.
Great. Well, so glad that you're safe and you're well. Admiral Stavridis doesn't really need an introduction, but let me just share with you a little bit of his incredible lifetime of moral leadership and service. Admiral Stavridis retired from the Navy after 37 years of service, Naval Academy graduate, as the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, and then went almost immediately, I think, sir, to be the dean, the 12th dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and now is serving as an operating executive with the Carlyle Group. Sir, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about moral leadership, particularly how you talk about communication and character and hope. And so I might start with just a question about you're quoting Napoleon quite often in terms of being a dealer of hope as part of being a leader. Why does that resonate with you so much?
Well, for starters, as you know, I'm about 5 feet 6 inches tall on a really good day. And so I love to quote Napoleon because short people have to stick together at all times. But I think the quote speaks for itself. Leaders need not to create an atmosphere of fear. Leaders need to put positive goals and vision out in front of people. People respond to that. People want to be for something. They don't want to be afraid of something. So in all of my time as a leader, I've tried to create an atmosphere in which people want to come to work. People want to be part of something larger than themselves. A way to think about it, kind of another quote from a different mentor of mine, if you will, is Colin Powell, who said that optimism is a force multiplier. Now, that's kind of military speak, but what it says, again, is that people want to believe they're going to succeed. And if you encourage them, they will almost always respond to that. I'll close on this by saying none of this should be interpreted as a kind of Pollyanna, gee, everything's going to be swell, because it often isn't. But what I have found in my life and career is the harder you work, the more optimistic you get, which is to say, if you put that positive goal in front of people, give them those tools and resources, they will stand and deliver in an atmosphere of optimism. That's how you become a dealer in hope.
You also talk about characteristics like listening as being an important quality of a moral leader and linking that together with humility. And then you say that listening and humility are a gateway to humor. I'll use a Harvard term, but I wonder if you might unpack those together for us.
I can, and I'll kind of do it by telling you about a terrific mentor of mine named Bob Gates, former Secretary of Defense, former director of the CIA. And it's a story about listening. And here I was, 37 years in the Navy, finally finishing up as Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, and I was trying to figure out what to do next. And I would ask many of my mentors, and virtually all of them immediately had a plan for Stavridis. Only Secretary Gates kind of hit pause and started asking questions. And one of the questions he asked me, very important question, Admiral, Jim, what kept you in the Navy for 37 years? Because maybe that will tell you what you ought to do next. And I really hadn't stopped to ask myself that. And I kind of rolled the reel back of my 37 years, and I realized that I liked a lot about the Navy. But what I loved was taking care of young men and women, of mentoring people. And it became clear to me when I said that to Secretary Gates, he said, you ought to be an educator. That's how I became the dean of the Fletcher School. Good leaders stop and ask questions and listen before they start prescribing solutions.
How does it listening then partner with humility as a characteristic of a moral leader, and then humor, particularly in some of the real serious situations, obviously, you've been leading within? How do humility and humor play into characteristics of moral leaders?
First and most prosaically, if you're willing to sublimate your ego, and you're willing not to be the center of attention, and you're willing not to be declaiming the answer immediately to every problem to demonstrate your brilliance, then you have time to actually listen. And a leader that I worked for who was superb at that, not as well known as Secretary Gates, but equally good as a leader, was Secretary of the Navy, Richard Danzig. I was his chief of staff for several years, and every time he approached a problem, he would ask people to come and just listen to them. So that's sublimating the ego. The sense of humor piece is kind of in two flavors. Some people are just genuinely funny. They can hit you with a great line. They have wonderful mannerisms. The expression on their faces is humorous. Secretary Danzig has all those qualities. He has a way with words that can lighten the mood, create a zinging one-liner. If you have that gift, terrific. If you don't have that gift, don't try to fake it. But you can still have a sense of humor in the sense of keeping things in perspective. When things go wrong, kind of roll your eyes a little bit, throw your hands up. Hey, we'll get through this. Keeping the mood light is the point of this. Not that you have to be a professional comic, but if you do have that facility, and I'll tell you another leader who is very, very funny in a private setting, is former Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld. Now that may surprise people because his public persona is very serious, very direct, and he certainly is in those settings. But in a quiet meeting, in a late night travel, very, very funny. And good leaders who have that facility, I find, can deploy it in ways that can lighten the mood and make people want to be part of the team.
Let me ask a little bit more about communications. With a title like Supreme Allied Commander Europe and the vast responsibility you had in NATO, communication at all levels had to be incredibly difficult. And so I'm curious if you might talk to us a little bit about particularly some of the tough decisions that you had to make and how you communicated that through those multiple levels and the multinational global influence and keep hope within people.
In an organization like NATO with 28 different nations, you have to be deeply respectful of the culture and the history of all of those countries. So, for example, fairly soon after I took command, we were tasked to create a surge of forces to Afghanistan. So my job, one of my jobs, was to go to each capital, to brief the Prime Minister, to brief the Minister of Defense, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Chief of Defense, each nation's equivalent of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and to brief their general staff and explain why we needed more troops, and effectively, here's what we're going to ask you for, France, or Germany, or Spain, or Albania, or Croatia. And so, Dana, those were tough meetings. No one wants to spend more money and above all send more troops into combat. So in addition to all of the hard work my staff put into understanding the nuances of the military resources and the capabilities of each of these 28 nations, I took it as my part of the bargain to do a deep dive in the history and culture and even the literature of each of these nations. I think the answer to the question is when you have to communicate difficult decisions, you need to have all the facts, you need to have ruthlessly competent professionalism in your briefings, but you also have to have a deep understanding of the culture and the history of these nations, in this case, or the organization to whom you are turning. It's almost like hard power and soft power. You need both if you're going to move a difficult position over the line. We have to appreciate those differences in our interlocutors. That's point one. Point two is, for us, if you will, in the West, our values matter. They matter deeply. And so you need to pause and ask, what are our values? And they are political, certainly, democracy, liberty. But they're also philosophical, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of education, freedom of assembly. And they are based in equities, gender equality, racial equality. We exercise, support, and fulfill those values imperfectly, unevenly, but they are the right values. And so what I have found universally is that if we understand our values and articulate them, and this is why the Howe Institute is so important to me. It's because it is stopping, hitting pause, and talking consciously about values.
You've written several books, The Accidental Admiral, The Leader's Bookshelf, and now Sailing True North, 10 Admirals' Voyage of Character. And I'd love to explore that with you a little bit of the title, Voyage. I kind of went to journey, but is it talking about like a lifetime of learning, or help us understand a little bit about that, the voyage part of character?
Sure. The book is my 9th book, and the full title is Sailing True North, 10 Admirals and the Voyage of Character. And I decided to write the book, Dana, because there's a difference between leadership and character. And it's, in my view, kind of a big difference. Leadership, a way to think about it, leadership is this big door that swings through the world, and it influences people. It changes the course of events. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a great leader. His leadership changed the world. But Pol Pot of Cambodia was a great leader. He mobilized his society for tragic means. He created a genocidal regime that killed millions in the killing fields of Cambodia. But they were both highly effective leaders. The difference is character. And back to that door that swings. That door of leadership swings on the hinge of character. And character looks like a small hinge, but doors don't swing unless the hinges work. And so I feel like we're awash in books of leadership. You walk through an airport bookstore, you'll see 22 books, everything from the leadership secrets of Attila the Hun to what I learned making breakfast about leadership. Forget those. Focus on character. And so I wanted to write a book about what we do when we think no one is looking. That's character. And that's at the heart of Howe, the terrific book by Dov Seidman, who founded the Howe Institute, about why how we do things matters deeply. So that's the frame of the book. And then, you know, I'm an admiral, so I know history and I know admirals. I need to frame it up. And so I chose to tell the story of 10 different admirals going back 2,500 years and looking at their character and how that impacted their lives, their voyage, if you will. And then Dana tried to draw some broad lessons about character from those 10 stories. So that's the book. it was a wonderful book to write because it was like introducing myself to these 10 admirals and learning everything about them, and then telling the story, not of their leadership journey, but of their journey in character.
And I'm sure you saw some amazing examples on the abhorrent end as well as on the admirable end. I'm wondering if there aren't any cross-cutting themes that, or behaviors that you observed that would be helpful for our listeners to hear. What were threads across people who are leaders of character, moral leaders?
Yeah, this is really the question at the heart of the book. And the qualities that I found repeatedly in leaders of character may or may not surprise you. One we've talked about already, and it's humility, empathy, listening, that cluster of attributes. Number two, and these are not in descending order, but a second significant one is innovation, openness to change. That is a quality of character in my view. And it goes to self-confidence, it goes to optimism. Innovators are optimists. Innovators are dealers in hope by definition, right? And again in the voyages of these admirals, as diverse as Admiral Sir Jackie Fisher at the turn of the last century, pulling the Royal Navy into the 20th century and breaking what Winston Churchill called the traditions of the Royal Navy, rum, buggery, and the lash. Jackie Fisher, to someone like Grace Hopper, a woman admiral who literally drags the Navy kicking and screaming into the computer age. She is one of the very first women officers in the Navy and is undoubtedly the smartest mathematician who have ever served in a uniform, and uses humor and innovation to pull the Navy forward. So each of these stories has a character quality to it, but I would put those two at the very top of consistent, strong performance.
Mm-hmm. I think Grace Hopper, didn't she coin the term a bug in the system?
She did, and the bug was actually a bug. It was actually a moth, and if you go to the Smithsonian in Washington, you can actually see the moth that was the bug in the very first huge UNIVAC IBM computer, which they were working on during World War II. It's a great story, and that's her, the bug in the system.
And how would you say that these 10 admirals that you reviewed inspired hope? If you had to give an elevator pitch of how do I become a moral leader that inspires hope from their 10 stories, what would it be?
I think of the 10 admirals, the one I'd point to is actually the most ancient of all of them. His name was Themistocles of Athens. And Themistocles was a politician, general turned admiral, who was put in charge of the Athenian fleet 2,500 years ago. Themistocles knows he is terribly outnumbered. And so he has to be a dealer in hope. And here's what he does. He knows that all of those massive Persian warships are rowed by slaves, not by free men. All of his ships are rowed by free men, by Greeks, by Athenians. He gathers his crews together on the night before what will be the epic Battle of Salamis, and he says to his combined rowers and captains, numbering in their thousands, tomorrow you must row for your city. Tomorrow you must row for your families. And tomorrow, free men, you must row for freedom. The Athenians went to sea the next morning and they destroyed the Persian fleet. We would probably be speaking Farsi right now if they had not. This is one of these pivotal battles in not just Greek history or Persian history. This is in human history. This preserves the nascent democracy of the Greek city-states. It's an epic moment, and it's an example, Themistocles, of finding exactly the right lever to inspire his people to be that dealer in hope on a morning that looked extremely bleak.
Wondering if you might share with us, of all the books, and I know you have read many, you've referred to many, one that particularly resonates with you in terms of moral leadership, an example of moral leadership.
Yeah, I'll give you a couple. First of all, yes, I love books. I have 5,000 books in my house. I wrote a book called The Leader's Bookshelf, which is 50 books that make you a better leader. And one of those books, by the way, is How by Dov Seidman. So I'm going to pull one book from that list that I would really encourage everyone to go back and reread, because you probably read it when you were 14, 15, 16 years old. The book is called To Kill a Mockingbird. So to have read that book in my teens, great book, kind of in the back of my mind, read it again in my late 50s, writing The Leader's Bookshelf. Boy, what a different book. Boy, what a different country we're in today. Boy, what a different understanding we have about young women. Pretty extraordinary book. So there's one that I would highly recommend. A second one, and it's about a terrible moral choice, is an old Cold War book, which I just also reread. And it's called The Bedford Incident. And Bedford is a U.S. Navy ship, the USS Bedford. And the Bedford is up on patrol in the height of the Cold War, up in the north, and starts to track a Soviet submarine. And through a terrible accident on the ship, the captain at one point is tracking behind the submarine, and the captain says, "If he fires one at me, I'll fire one." And the fire control officer on the destroyer hears that and says, "Fire one eye, sir," and launches a nuclear depth charge and destroys the Soviet submarine. What happens next, which I will not reveal, is a terrible but a moral choice that occurs on the high seas at the height of the Cold War. It's a powerful book, The Bedford Incident by Mark Raskovich. So there's two.
Wonderful, and gets us back to communication. I'm going to finish with one final question, but I want to recap your characteristics of leadership as you have shared them. Ability to listen. Leaders should be readers, including novels, which you do as well. Leaders need to be innovators, team builders, and leaders need to be communicators. And you've talked about this as being really hard, even using the term rough seas, and challenges right now that we are in a different time with so many different crises, including injustice, the pandemic, economy, and the list goes on. So as we round out this How conversation on moral leadership, communication, being conveyors, and dealers in hope, what would you like to leave us with in terms of how do we travel these rough seas? What would you say is important for us to kind of keep that hope?
One thing that is overarching and one thing is foundational. Overarching is keep your perspective. One way to do that is just go back 100 years ago. The world is coming out of a pandemic called the Spanish influenza, much worse than what we are going to end up with in COVID. The world is about to see the rise of fascism and stumble into a near-apocalyptic Second World War in which 70 million people are going to die. Keep your perspective. We have come a long way, and I am optimistic cautiously optimistic that that string of progress will continue. And within that idea of perspective, look to history for examples of good leaders. And here I would say the next biography you read should be a biography of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a leader who faced challenges that dwarf anything President Trump is dealing with. He was an unbelievable communicator, right? In an era when tweets were something a bird said and clouds were in the sky, no internet, no television, scratchy radio broadcasts, he captivates and inspires the nation at arguably our worst moment other than the Civil War. Pretty remarkable performance. Read a biography of Roosevelt for perspective.
Thank you for inspiring us with such wonderful wisdom, your moral leadership example, things for us to be reminded of, things for us to read, and mostly for your communication and purveyor and dealer in hope. Thank you for that example. Thank you for spending the time sharing your talents and your gifts, and we're so glad that you followed that guidance on continuing to develop future leaders of character and future moral leaders. And your support on the board of the Howe Institute for Society is admirable. Got to keep that humor in there, sir.
Yeah, well, General Dana Born, let me also close by saying thank you to you for being an educator, a general officer in the Air Force, and an inspiration to so many, particularly young women, but really to airmen everywhere, every time. I'm proud of you as well. Thanks for having me on.